What's up, and welcome to Chapter 19 of AMSCO U.S. History, The Politics of the Gilded Age, from 1877 to 1900. As always, please make sure to subscribe, like, comment, and share with your friends. Thanks so much, and help me reach 500 subs. So the word The Gilded Age was actually first used by Mark Twain in 1873, and it was the title of a book, and it basically was referring to the superficial glitter of the new wealth so prominently displayed in the 19th century. So as you may remember, industry was growing really big at this time, and there was lots of manufacturing and new wealth as a result of all this industrialization. Historians, however, often say the politics of this era were really nothing. It was sort of like this era of forgettable presidents where a series of presidents came into power. They didn't really serve more than 2 terms, and the politicians largely ignored the problems with this growth of industry in cities. And the biggest thing was that these 2 major parties really avoided taking stands on controversial issues, so nothing really got done. And as a result, it was sort of like, although the outside was gold, inside it was not, and there were problems in America. Government did pass some regulations, such as the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887, and this was the federal government's first effort to regulate business. The Interstate Commerce Commission soon followed, and this agency basically had the power to investigate and prosecute pools in business, rebates, and other discriminatory practices. So pools were where people would put their money together. Rebates, companies would offer rebates to other companies if they shipped in bulk or whatever. And discriminatory practices really resulted in some people not being able to have a fair chance at competition. Ironically, though, the first U.S. Regulatory Commission helped the railroads at first, which it was trying to actually control more than the farmers, but eventually it was able to get itself together and stabilize rates and curtail destructive competition to eventually help farmers primarily. Another area of regulation was the Pendleton Act of 1881, and so President Garfield, who was the president at this time, he pushed Congress to remove certain government jobs from the control of party patronage. So basically, if you were part of a party, you kind of just got the job, regardless of whether you were qualified or not. Well, this new act set up the Civil Service Commission and created a system by which applicants for classified federal jobs would be selected on the basis of their scores on a competitive test. And it also prohibited civil servants from making political contributions, to try to buy their way into the job. And at first, this law was really small, applying to only 10% of employees, but later it was expanded until most of these jobs were classified, which means taken out of the hands of politicians. And this was really good because now regular citizens could just have a fair opportunity at a government job instead of trying to work their way into the political parties and get influence. Politicians at this time, such as John Sherman, who was the brother of the famous Civil War general, also passed a number of bills, and one was the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. So this act basically tried to outlaw the combinations and restraint of trade, so it tried to break up the monopolistic trusts that were prevalent in this area. And it basically just prohibited any contract, combination in the form of trust or otherwise, or conspiracy and restraint of trade or commerce. So basically what it was trying to do is knock down the unfair competition and allow regular market competition and capitalism to take its role and regulate the American economy. Grangers were this farmers' alliance group, and they had a long tradition of independence and individualism that farmers really liked. And so it really began with the National Grange movement, and this was basically the National Grange of Patrons of Husbandry was organized in 1868 as a social and educational organization for farmers and their families, so really to help them. And they were really active in the economics and politics of the time and wanted to defend their members, the farmers, against middlemen, trusts, and railroads, because these people all wanted to take a cut out of the profits of farmers. So these grangers established cooperatives, basically businesses owned and run by farmers to save the costs charged by middlemen, and they resided all over the United States, but primarily in what is the Midwest today. So also local businesses supported them as well, and ultimately this really helped to start farmers' alliances and help farmers sort of get back into this growing American economy. Grangers were a type of farmers' alliances, and farmers' alliances usually selected members to the Senate and the House of Representatives, even governors of several states, and the majorities in 4 state legislatures, even in the West. So farmers' alliances were really big for the farmers and rural people during this time period. Like the Grange, these alliances also taught scientific farming methods to try to increase yield. But unlike the Grange, they always had the goal of economic and political action. So they were always trying to create an independent national political party. And at one point, they were even able to capture many people to join this movement and make a dent in some elections around the United States. So with the Grange movement and all these farmers' alliances, eventually this movement provided the foundation of a new political party, the People's, or also known as the Populist Party. And these people supported an ideal called populism. Basically, whatever the people wanted most, they would do. So delegates from different states actually met together to establish a political platform and nominate candidates for president and vice president. So populists really wanted to do something different, primarily about the concentration of economic power in the hands of trusts and bankers. So trusts and bankers were the richest at this time, and if you weren't one of those, you might be a populist because you didn't want like 99% of the wealth going to them. Delegates from different states finally met in Omaha, Nebraska in 1892 to draft this new political platform called the Omaha Platform and nominate candidates for certain positions. And part of their job was they wanted to establish political and economic reforms. So politically, they wanted the direct election of U.S. senators because at this time, senators were elected indirectly by state legislatures. They also wanted initiatives and referendums, basically procedures that allowed citizens to vote directly on proposed laws instead of having to go through politicians to be passed. Economically, they also wanted unlimited coinage of silver to increase the money supply, so a ton of inflation, a graduated income tax, so the richer a person was, they would have to pay a higher percent tax, public ownership of railroads by the U.S. government, so private companies couldn't start fluctuating the prices, telegraph and telephone systems also owned by the government, and loans and federal warehouses for farmers to enable them to stabilize prices for their crops, sort of to be safer. And also an 8-hour workday for industrial workers, which was revolutionary at this time. So this movement at the time was really sort of revolutionary because it attacked the standard laissez-faire capitalism, and it was also an attempt to form a political alliance between poor whites and poor blacks, because even so at this time, there was a big problem of segregation. In the election of 1892, the Populists finally had a good showing. They won more than 1 million votes and even 22 electoral votes. So this was one of the few third-party candidates in history to win votes actually in the Electoral College. Even with this, they lost really bad in the South and couldn't attract urban workers in the North. So Populists also uniting different types of races sort of drove conservatives from the South, the Redeemers, really to dislike African Americans even more. The two major parties, Democrats and Republicans, had a rematch between President Benjamin Harrison at this time and former President Grover Cleveland, and this time Cleveland won a solid victory in both the popular and electoral vote, and this was because of an unpopular tariff. And with this, also, the important thing is Cleveland became the first and only president thus far to return to the White House after having to leave it. So definitely history making here. The Gilded Age had three major political issues. They were issues of the civil service, currency, and tariffs. So we already talked a little bit about the civil service reform with the Pendleton Act of 1881. And as a result, politicians had to adapt to all these reforms by depending less on many party workers to help them run campaigns and instead more on the rich to fund their campaigns. And of course, this is still a continuation to today. Also, there was a money question. So there was lots of money, obviously, at this time with growth of industry, and many people wanted to still expand the money supply. So if the economy needed to grow a lot, there needed to be more money in circulation. But this money question also started to have tensions between the people who had it and those who didn't. So the debtors, farmers, and startup businesses, they really wanted easy or soft money, quote, because this would, of course, cause inflation. They could borrow at lower interest rates and pay off their loans more easily. This was a big debate between many people. And they also wanted the increase of paper money, so these were greenbacks that were not backed by precious metals such as gold and silver, and they also wanted unlimited mining of silver coins. rich people at this time, like the bankers, creditors, investors, they really owned all the money and they wanted sound or hard money. So this was currency backed by precious metal, primarily gold, and they were stored in government vaults. So they wanted this because their money would not be inflated and they would still keep the same value that they already had. And they knew that as the US economy and population grew more than the number of gold-backed dollars, each dollar would gain in value, so it would make them even more rich. And this thing did occur, but it also created many political issues. Ultimately, another thing was tariffs. At this time, tariffs actually provided more than half of all federal revenue at this time. So Western farmers and Eastern capitalists really disagreed on what the tariff rates on foreign imports should be. So the farmers were buying like foreign products, so they didn't like these tariffs, while the Eastern capitalists, they were producing stuff and regulating money, and so they wanted these tariffs to protect their own industry. So during the Civil War, Congress had raised tariffs to protect the industry and the Union government. But after the war, Southern Democrats, of course, came back into power, and they didn't like these high tariffs on consumer goods. And another result was that other nations, of course, retaliated by placing own tariffs on U.S. farm products. So once again, bad for farmers. Farmers lost overseas sales, and that contributed to increases of their products, corn and wheat, lower farm prices, and lower profits as well. So industry seemed to be getting rich while the farmers were being poor at this time. The election of 1896 was the beginning of a new era in American politics. So the Democratic Party split during this election. Some of the Democrats who wanted unlimited gold, they supported a populist leader, William Bryan Jennings, and this really helped to increase the amount of silver and gold in the market, but also caused lots of inflation. To this regard, the Democrats had basically taken over the leading issue of the populist platform, so sort of transforming into this. Well, the Democrats that didn't like all this gold and free silver was a conservative faction, and they formed the separate National Democratic Party, and they, of course, submitted Cleveland back up for re-election, or others just switched parties and voted Republican. So over in the Republicans nominated William McKinley of Ohio, and he really was known for his support of a high protective tariff and was really nice toward labor, so this was sort of like their guy. They tried to blame the Democrats for many problems of the time, such as the Panic of 1893, and they wanted a promise of a strong and prosperous industrial nation again. They, of course, as McKinley said, proposed a high tariff to protect industry and upheld the gold standard, so no unlimited coinage of silver. Eventually, McKinley and his gang were able to win, and they were able to carry the election of 1896. Even with Bryan traversing the U.S. and trying to campaign a lot, he was still not able to beat McKinley, who was funded by the rich people of the Northeast, and that ultimately lost the campaign for Bryan. Lots of Democrats during this time wanted a new leader that was more for promoting unlimited supply of silver, and so one person who addressed all these delegates at the convention was William Jennings Bryan, and he gave this really powerful speech. It basically ended with, "You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold," and this became known as the Cross of Gold speech, that it made him instantly the Democratic nominee for president. But while making him the president, it also split the Democratic Party and ultimately did not really help him win the election. In the spring and summer of 1893, the stock market crashed because, it crashes like every 20 years. And this was a result of overspeculation, so trying to guess the prices of things too much. And dozens of railroads went into bankruptcy as a result of overbuilding, so this took a tank on the economy as well. This depression lasted around 4 years, and farm foreclosures also were high. Unemployment was also high. Many people had to end up relying on soup kitchens and riding the rails as hobos, so like homeless people, because they didn't really have any other choice. And President Cleveland, so he was the president at this time, he dealt with the crisis by championing the gold standard, but otherwise adopting a hands-off policy toward the economy. So he didn't really want to do much to solve this new crisis. Eventually, the depression worsened, and as more jobless people grew, there were populist leaders such as Jacob A. Coxey of Ohio, who organized sort of a Coxey's army. And these people, they marched to Washington by the thousands, and they really wanted to demand the federal government to spend $500 million on public works programs to create jobs, so sort of like a socialism. And Coxey and other protest leaders were arrested for trespassing, I guess, property grounds, and the dejected marchers really didn't achieve anything and ultimately had to go home. However, they showed that people were finally seeking the government in some instances when they really could not survive. So this has been The Politics of the Gilded Age, Chapter 19 from 1877 to 1900. Thanks so much for watching, and hope to see you in the next one when we continue the story of America.